Dr. Daniel Amen is a psychiatrist, brain imaging expert, best-selling author, and medical director of the Amen Clinics. He has pioneered the use of brain imaging in clinical psychiatric practice and is a noted expert in the field of the brain and behavior. Dr. Amen's breakthrough research and insights provide hope and more effective treatment for millions of people today.
There are many people who are anxious or depressed or obsessive, prone to anger, they have attentional problems, and they thought their problems were all in their head, purely psychological, if you will. In the research that I've done, what we found is that these and many other problems are brain-based problems, and that when we optimize the brain, their lives become better. We often say, change your brain, change your life, and that's what we've seen. We're going to ultimately ask this question today, and the question is, which brain do you want? Do you want the healthy brain, so the brain's in the center, or do you want one that is toxic? And addictions clearly ruin people's lives, families' lives, and cost us billions of dollars. I found this quote from Buddha. I liked it. You, yourself, I added your brain, as much as anybody in the entire universe deserve your love and affection, much like a mother will groom her child, or in this case, a mother will groom her puppy. Your brain's important. Solomon had a diagnostic checklist for alcoholism, 900 BC. Proverbs 23:29. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? As you read that, he's describing why people drink sometimes. He's describing sorrow. He's describing conflict, strife, complaining, anxiety. Redness equals dullness. And he continues, those who linger long over wine, those who go to taste mixed wine. So here, 900 BC, we're talking about mixed drinks and graduating to mixed drinks. It starts simple. That's a theme we're going to talk about today, how things often start in a simple way. And he continues, do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. So here, I think he's talking about obsession and looking forward to the experience of drinking or using. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Alcohol poisons the system. You can be nauseous, you can be trembling. Did you know people who go through delirium tremens, which is a form of withdrawal from alcoholism, 10% of people who go through DTs die. It's not a minor problem. I mean, we often think of it as a medical emergency. Your eyes will see strange things. 900 BC, they're talking about hallucinations that go along with either intoxication or withdrawal. And your mind will utter perverse things. We're going to talk about why people act badly when they drink or do drugs. I'm going to show you a couple of brains that are intoxicated that we scanned. So lusting after strange women and other men's wives, visual hallucinations, seeing double, seeing coarse, being coarse, vulgar talk, spiritual, and financial bankruptcy is often the result. And he continues, and you will be like one who lies down in the middle of the sea, or like one who lies down on the top of a mast, reeling and staggering of the drunken man dangers he exposes himself to, bad judgment. So right away you can pick what part of the brain gets fried with alcohol. Frontal lobes. They struck me, but I did not become ill. They beat me, but I did not know it. Beaten and struck down. So numbed, so anesthetized that they didn't feel it. Beaten and did not know it. Have you heard about blackouts? That people, one of the signs of alcoholism is you drink and you have no clue how you got home. You just don't remember. Or you have no clue how badly you acted at a party. Or you have no clue you got married. Any rock star sort of comes to mind? When shall I awake? I will seek another drink. End stages of alcoholism. Obsessed to the point that you begin drinking in the morning. The numbers of addictions in the United States are just staggering. In 2001 in the United States, 17 million abused or were dependent on either alcohol or illicit drugs. The highest rate of abuse or dependence on alcohol or illicit drugs was among 21-year-olds. Now, why is that a problem? Because the brain is still developing. The brain is still laying down a lot of myelin in the frontal cortex. And if you are poisoning it at a time it's going through a developmental stage, you may permanently be 20. Which I would submit to you, now that I'm going to be 50 this year, is a really bad thing. Right? I mean, it's great if your muscles could be 20, but still have the maturity of somebody who's 30 or 40, even 50. Percentage of the population using illicit drugs increased from 6.3% in 1999 and 2000 to 7.1% in 2001. So we still don't have a handle on it, despite DARE, despite all of the drug prevention programs. It's still a massive problem. And even though teenagers get education, they still do a lot of stupid things. Males are classified with dependence or abuse of alcohol twice as much as female. So women have twice as much depression, men have twice as much substance abuse. It's estimated that 7 million are driving under the influence of alcohol or illicit drugs in the last year. According to the National Transportation of Safety, 10% of the people driving toward you on Saturday night are legally drunk. Steel is good for your car, right? Driving little tiny cars is dangerous, especially if you're going to drive Saturday night. And what do we do with teenagers? We buy them little tiny cars because they're cheap and not that, not that big a deal. And I have to tell you, I think you should put teenagers in the safest vehicles possible if you like them. Because the chances that they get into accidents are very high. This next point is critical. Youth who smoke cigarettes. Say the rate in the past month who used. 42% of them will use illegal drugs. Youth who do not smoke cigarettes, 4.6 will use illegal drugs. So it's illegal to, smoke cigarettes or to go and buy cigarettes when you're less than 18. If you can do something that is illegal, you are much more likely to say yes to other illegal activities. So it's sort of the moral bankruptcy slippery slope, if you will. That's why nicotine prevention is critical in kids, because it's the first thing that they say yes to. And if you're smoking at home and modeling that behavior, it's a dramatic increased chance your children will do it. Now, maybe it's because they inherit the same sleepy frontal lobes and they want to get juiced up and they feel normal when they smoke, or maybe it's modeled behavior. But whatever it is, this seems to be the first thing that we should be paying attention to. There are other addiction numbers. 2.9% of the US adults are considered either pathological or problem gamblers. So think about it. 3% of 300 million is like what? It's almost 9 million people have problems with gambling. If you want to read a good book about compulsive gamblers, read Pete Rose's autobiography. It's really quite a good book. And there's a lot of very interesting information on it. And I mean, right away, he comes out and says he is diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, excitement-seeking behavior, oppositional defiant disorder, very highly correlates with addictions, and he's a compulsive gambler. I mean, it basically ruined his chance of getting into the Hall of Fame. I mean, who knows if that'll change, but it's bad to bet on baseball if you're a manager. In the US, there's 25 million men, 22 million women who are smokers. So a quarter of men and a fifth of the women are smokers. 30% of coffee drinkers say they couldn't do without it, probably mildly addicted. 27 million US visited adult-oriented pornographic websites in 2002, in January of 2002, so 8% of the population. How many did it at work? None of my employees. Okay, now as we talk about addictions, we have to go through these same principles that I'm sort of drilling in your head about the work that we do, because it applies to addictions. And the first principle is your brain's involved in everything you do. How you think, how you feel, how you act, how well you get along with other people has to do with your brain. It determines who you are as a grandmother, as a spouse, as a friend, as a child, as a parent. And what is happening if you're polluting it? You are not going to be your best self. She was not drunk when I took this picture. She was just having a good time. I mean, isn't that better to have a good time and you can remember it? So that goes into the second principle, which is when your brain works right, you work right. And when your brain is troubled, this is a heroin brain, you are troubled. You know what else does this? Is benzos do it. Medicines like Valium, like Ativan, Xanax, Klonopin, painkillers like OxyContin does that. One of the most common, relatively newer drugs of abuse. The brain is amazing. I mean, it's complicated. It's estimated we have 100 billion nerve cells, and each nerve cell is connected to other nerve cells by up to 40,000 individual connections. So you have more connections than there are stars in the universe. I mean, your brain is just so amazing, even though it's just a little bit of your total body. It uses 20 to 30% of the calories you consume. So it's the major heater, if you will, the major energy user in your body. And it's soft, like a raw egg or soft butter. I mean, why is that important? Because your skull is hard, and mild traumatic brain injuries matter. And who gets head injuries? People who are driving drunk have higher rates of head injuries. So having a head injury increases substance abuse. I mean, like 60% when you look at the studies. People who've had severe head injuries have dramatically increased use of substances. But if you're drunk, if you're high, If you're slow on pot, that increases your risk of having a brain injury. We'll talk more about that. Certain brain areas are involved in certain behaviors. Talked about that. Your frontal lobes are involved with judgment. Your temporal lobes with memory. Your parietal lobes with direction sense. So it would fit that problems in certain brain areas tend to cause certain problems. So if you're drunk and you get into an accident and you're drunk, so that's already hurting your frontal lobes. The accident's now hurting your frontal lobes. You're going to have executive problems. Or if they hurt your temporal lobes, you're going to have memory problems. Or if it hurts your cerebellum, you're going to have problems with coordination, thought coordination. So you're going to get confused more easily. Which then leads us to most psychiatric illnesses, including substance abuse, are not single or simple disorders. So if you're looking for that one brain of an alcoholic, forget it. There are multiple reasons why people drink. If you're going to look at that one pattern for a cocaine addict, you won't find it because there are reasons. Now, people tend to calm down hot brains, stimulate cold brains, but there are different kinds of substance abuse, like there's different kinds of depression and different kinds of ADD and so on. And imaging helps. I can't tell you. This probably, early on when I was doing imaging, the most exciting thing was being able to show somebody their scan that looked toxic and go, this is healthy, this is yours. And people would just like get blown away. And about 70% of the time, seeing the image helped them stop. Because now they could really relate it to themselves. Because what is one of the biggest problems in substance abuse? They don't see immediate decline. They don't believe they have a problem. I can control it. I got it together. Leave me alone about it. It's my wife's problem. And you show them a picture like this, it's like, it's your problem. It was really hard to be in denial when you see a healthy brain versus one that is toxic. This is actually a case. This guy came to see me because his psychologist said this guy just doesn't get that he has a problem. He was drinking alcohol and using cocaine. So cocaine during the day, get himself up. He was running a very large computer company. That's why the computer company, they had a lot of bugs in their software, I think. And so cocaine during the day and alcohol at night. And he didn't believe he had a problem until he saw his scan, which is the one on the left. And those massive holes are overall severe areas of decreased activity. The next day, he went to the Meadows, which is an inpatient substance abuse treatment program. I mean, the next day, he's like, I get it. And a year later, the only treatment was, without medication, was substance abuse treatment. And the brain on the right is his brain a year later. Now, it's not normal, but it's a lot better. And a lot of people ask themselves, if I stop, will it get better? Now, some researchers say no. My experience is depends. Depends on how much you used, how long you used, what you used was laced with, because a lot of this stuff is made in the garages in Barstow. And your own genetic vulnerability. If you have the ApoE4 gene that we talked about earlier that puts you at risk for Alzheimer's disease, you're probably at much greater risk with low levels of substance abuse. I mean, it's one of the interesting things that we've seen. Some people abuse for just a little bit and their brains are awful. Other people abuse for a long time and their brains aren't that bad. So part of it has to do with genetic vulnerability, sort of like everything else. So we look at the brain with this study called SPECT. Stands for, again, single photon emission computed tomography. It's a nuclear medicine study that looks at blood flow and activity patterns in the brain. And it's not like
you know, these ideas that I'm giving you is based on 35 cases that we saw. I mean, goodness, we probably have more than 2,000 substance abusing brains, and they're not pretty. By and large, they're not one you want to take home to your mother. Okay, so when we look at the scans today, remember we're going to look at healthy areas of activity, too little and too much. And right away, hopefully in your mind, you're going, well, if it's hot, somebody's going to want to settle it down. And if it's cold, somebody's going to want to ramp it up or fire it up. So, healthy scan, full, even, symmetrical activity. This is a beautiful brain. A beautiful brain. 82-year-old brain. I mean, it's just, it'll blow you away how healthy this brain is. If I saw this brain in a 10-year-old, I'd be pleased with it. So, this is an example of the hot spots in the brain. Back is hot where the cerebellum is. Everything else is relatively cool. Now, there's different types of addictions. As we talk about addictions, and we'll focus probably more on alcohol and drug abuse, but there are lots. From nicotine and caffeine, there are sexual addictions, gambling, sugar, other forms of food, work, video games. Isn't it interesting? Video games boost dopamine production in the brain. They make you feel more alert, more alive, more awake. But there are some people who get addicted to it, where they get withdrawal. They play more and more, even though they're supposed to be doing something else, that it causes problems for you. You can be addicted to the internet, and you can be addicted to excitement. You just have to have that new, next, exciting thing that could be lethal for you. I think some of these survivor shows are with people who are addicted to excitement. All right, so what makes an addiction? Well, according to people like the World Health Organization and the American Medical Association, there are a number of components to addiction. The first one is something called tolerance. And what tolerance means is it takes more and more of something to get the same response. If you have somebody coming in and they say, yeah, I drank a case of beer on Saturday, they're tolerant. Right? Most people who don't drink very much, if they drink a case, they're sick. So just look at the level of what people use. And it happens with nicotine, which is why they end up smoking more and more, caffeine, gambling, and so on. So tolerance takes more and more to get the same effect. And withdrawal, what happens if we stop? Do you have negative feelings? So, I mean, people who, and a very simple way to think about it is if what you're using is a downer, alcohol, benzos like Valium, heroin, painkillers, if what you use suppresses your system, the withdrawal is going to be rebound in the opposite way. Not going to sleep. Your GI tract is going to start racing. You're going to feel anxious, nervous, tense. You're going to be at risk for seizure disorders. So your system that was sedated is now reactive. Now, if you use things that jack you up, that stimulate you, withdrawal is going to be what? You're going down. When I was at Fort Irwin, I was the chief psychiatrist at Fort Irwin for 2 years. There are many soldiers who were using methamphetamines because they kept these kids up for 3 days at a time doing field exercises. It's not that smart. But they used methamphetamines to stay up. And I would get calls from their commander, Bill has been in bed for 3 days. The first thing you got to think about is methamphetamine withdrawal. Right? So things that get you stimulated, like cocaine or methamphetamines or a lot of nicotine, caffeine, legal stimulants like Ritalin. You don't have any more. You feel tired, sluggish, sleepy. And for the heavy duty ones like cocaine and methamphetamine, you may go to bed for a long time. So you get withdrawal. So tolerance, withdrawal. And if you do it and you have negative consequences from it, fights with your wife, you lose your job, you have problems with your health, high blood pressure, you have liver problems, you become anemic. So what happens with alcohol is your red blood cells get big. So the size of your red blood cells, these little disc-shaped things that carry oxygen, they get large. Now why is that a problem? Isn't that good? No, because they get inefficient at carrying oxygen at that point. So if you see big red blood cells, it's one of the early signs of alcohol abuse. One of the things that we can measure and show people, look, this is a problem. So if you have negative consequences, and they don't stop the behavior, that's when we say you're addicted. See, now there's a difference between addiction and abuse. A lot of kids drink and abuse substances. But once they get that first DUI, they never drink again. I'll tell you my personal story. I was 16 years old as I was at a party at my brother's house. And I drank a 6-pack of Michelob and a half a bottle of champagne, all in about an hour. And I was so sick. I was sick for 5 days. And my father thought it was the funniest thing that he'd ever seen. And I was working in my dad's grocery store. And what he made me do the next couple of days is work in the liquor department. And I don't know if you've ever had a hangover. And then you spend time around bottles of wine and champagne that have, it just made me so nauseous. And I tell you, I hate drinking. I mean, I go to a lot of functions. I was at my son's wedding on Saturday, and there's, some alcohol, and there's no interest at all. So, time of abuse, got myself into hot water, physically, and I stopped. So we don't call that an addiction, right? It's when you get into trouble and you keep doing it. You've heard about these people that have 8 DUIs, right? It's like, how did they let this person out of jail? If you think of Robert Downey Jr. I mean, it's like having a gun to your head. That's what he said once. He said it's like having a gun to your head and still doing it, which means you have no control. And that's why we think of it as a disease. Because rational people don't do it. Okay. So how do addictions happen? Well, the first thing is there's some pleasure. And then you can't stop thinking about it. And then you have no control over it. And even when you try to get under control, triggers in the environment. A smell will cause you to start drinking again. Or somebody lighting a match will cause you to start smoking again. Or say after dinner, you always have a cigarette. Now you've stopped. And now it's after dinner. And you don't know what to do with yourself. And so those are the things that are triggers. And they can be sights, they can be smells, they can be sounds, they can be nearly anything. So if we take that same model and we look at pathological gamblers, the psychodynamics of pathological gambling almost always start with a big win. So what's that big win? Pleasure. I like the feeling. And then they chase the feeling. Then that's where they get obsessed. So the big win goes with high dopamine levels. The obsession, the high dopamine levels have trashed your serotonin levels because dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine, and serotonin in the brain are counterbalanced. So if one goes up, the other one seems to go down. They did a study on new love, people who just fell in love. And what they found is low levels of serotonin, which is the same thing we find in obsessive compulsive disorder. And if you remember the last time you fell in love, I mean, you're obsessed by it. You can't stop thinking about it. It takes all of your waking moments and so on. So, pleasure, obsession, lack of control, even to the point where you lose your house, or you lose your job, or you lose your wife, or you lose your family. You lose your health if you're betting with the wrong people. They break your kneecaps. And then later on, almost anything gambling related will trigger you. David Cummings is one of my favorite people. He's a geneticist at the City of Hope in Los Angeles. And he said that pathological gambling is a spectrum disorder. It shares genetic and symptoms with other problems, like obsessive compulsive disorder, like Tourette's syndrome, like attention deficit disorder. Multifactorial means there's many things that influence this behavior, and polygenic means as you look at your 46 chromosomes, they're not going to find it on one gene. There are actually many different contributors to it. And he thinks it has to do more commonly with abnormalities on the dopamine genes. In fact, they found if you have an abnormality in one of the genes, you really don't have a high risk. If you have an abnormality in 2, you have a pretty high risk. You have an abnormality in 3, you're going to have a problem. You have an abnormality in 4, you're going to be in jail. Isn't that interesting? A lot of this can be really thought of as genetic and biological. And if you do family histories, see, whenever you see a new client or you see a new patient, you have to do family history. Why? Because you'll learn about what people are vulnerable to in that particular family. Now, of course, you can overcome things, but family history is just critical. And he talks about, and other researchers talk about, reward deficiency syndrome, which means you don't just get enough pleasure from your own thoughts, your own life, that you're seeking excitement. And one of the reasons the Teen Challenge works for substance abusers is people get Christ. And they get connected. And there is a level of pleasure and joy and excitement, especially in Assemblies of God churches, that replace the substance. Did I tell you why I think Teen Challenge works? So, I mean, 1, you get connected to a group. And 2, you get God's help. How cool is that? And 3, they scare the socks off you with things like the rapture and the end of time and, burning forever in hell and, minor concepts like that. Probably a lot of dopamine associated with that. All right, so let's look more specifically at alcohol and drugs. Why do people drink? I was on my way last week to do a lecture at Cal State San Marcos, and I was with my general manager, who's a friend of mine, and I was working on the lecture, and I said, okay, John, why do people drink? His first comment was just brilliant. He said, look at liquor company ads. They know why people drink, and they go after people over and over again. I mean, they do serious research on why people drink. For sex. Heck, you can wrestle with 2 beautiful women, right? If you watch the beer commercial. Beach parties, fun, companionship, sophistication, especially for hard liquor. High class, power. I mean, it's not really true, but that's what the images you associate with drinking Chivas Regal and other sort of high class forms of alcohol. Some people really like the taste. Personally, it makes me sick, but that's because of my own aversive treatment. And if you look at the commercials today for beer, they imply you're going to lose weight on them. They're less carbs. And I'm like, yeah, but there's still calories in them. Because people perceive it as fun. It tastes twice. I wonder why. The next one, grease social gears, is critical. People drink because it settles down their anxiety and they feel more normal in social situations. I mean, if you take somebody who has a hot basal ganglia, I mean, I just take myself. You have a hot basal ganglia. In some social situations, you're just sort of nervous. And if you drink, you don't care quite so much. And so you might be able to ask that guy for dinner or ask that girl out, or, you know, be able to approach a group and not be so worried that they're going to judge you in a negative way. It numbs feeling. It's modeled sometimes by your parents or by your peer group. Think about that. Who you hang out with matters. That's what I tell teenagers all the time. You're going to become like the people you hang out with. So if your goal is to smoke a lot of pot, hang out with people who smoke pot. If your goal is to do well in school, figure out how to hang out with people who do well in school. Right? And be socially sophisticated. And no, there's no question in my mind, substance abuse treats anxiety and depression, or ADD. Anxiety and depression usually are treated with downers. If you have the type of anxiety and depression that's from a hot brain, so alcohol and heroin, ADD is treated usually with stimulants. Something that sort of helps you feel more energetic, more focused. And you drink or you use drugs because you're addicted and you can't stop, because it's hijacked your brain. Okay, who uses what drugs? Well, again, if you have overactivity in the brains, these are brains of people who have really hot scans, you use things to settle it down. If you have cold brains, you will use things to try and fire it up. And as you do histories, sometimes you will see that they're calming it down at night so they can sleep, and firing it up during the day, because some parts are hot, and some parts are cold. So, a little bit more maybe on why people use. They use alcohol, marijuana, opiates, painkillers, benzos, maybe to calm things down. Stimulants such as cocaine, methamphetamines, caffeine, nicotine enhance it, like an ADD, are also in brain damage, which often causes decreased activity. They're using ecstasy. It's often to treat depression. Because what ecstasy does is it floods the brain with serotonin. The problem is you've dumped it, and you have none of it when you stop using. So the incidence of anxiety and depression as withdrawal from ecstasy is very common. HBO and I did a story together called, it was for their program America Undercover, Small Town Ecstasy. Got nominated for a PRISM Award last year, which is sort of cool. And what we did is we scanned someone who had been a pretty serious ecstasy user, 19 years old. And when we scanned his brain, one of the hottest brains I'd ever seen. And with serotonin deficiency syndromes, what we see is they become obsessive, which is associated with hyperactivity in the brain. I mean, it's dramatically hyperactive, a very rare brain. Talking again about the slippery slope, often starts with nicotine. Smokers are dramatically increased risk for using drugs. You look at people who smoke pot, it's often people who want to escape their parents, escape anxiety. It's countercultural, almost anti-authoritarian. I mean, maybe not as much as it used to be, but that's what people think about it. And when you're able to do something illegal, underage drinking, smoking, using pot, it's much easier to disobey the law the next time. Sort of what we often talk about this with murderers. You kill somebody once, it's much easier for you to kill the second person. And it becomes really easy for you to kill the third or the fourth or the 15th person in some of the serial killers that we've seen. So another reason people use it's genetic. You have a family history of increased risk, watch out. And I have to tell you, for my kids, for my son who I adopted, his biological grandfather is a severe alcoholic. I mean, with all sorts of problems associated with it. Alcoholism often induces diabetes. He's lost both of his legs. His vision's not good. He was demented at 65, so pretty early. And his biological father, severe problems with alcohol abuse. He got fired from his job because he was drunk. He's a police officer, got drunk on the job and stole a 1-ounce shot glass from the bar. I mean, he lost his, government job for that. He was married 3 times. His physically and emotionally abusive with his wives. And at the age of 36, he shot and killed himself. So here is this boy who's got the genes coming down both sides. Now, I know this. So from the time he's little, in a loving way, I hammer him. If you never drink, you'll never have a problem. If you drink, you might have a serious problem. And, so I'm sure he hears my voice whenever he thinks about having a Corona, right? And it's critical. If parents don't talk to their kids about risk, they don't know. So it's like they're playing Russian roulette. But they have no clue that there's actually a live bullet in the chamber. And for my girls, significant alcoholism coming down one side, not the other side. But they're still at increased risk. And if you never drink, you'll never have a problem. And if you drink, you might have a big problem. There's also theories about dopamine, especially when it's involved in ADD. But there's another interesting theory. It's not proven, but people have been talking about it for a long time, and that's the thioquinolone theory. Thioquinolone is an extra substance in the brain. So when I drink, my body breaks alcohol down to water and vinegar. And, for me, it just sort of makes me nauseous. But for most people, they break down alcohol to water and vinegar, and they feel high, and then it's gone. People have the genetic vulnerability to alcoholism, at least according to this theory, is they break down alcohol to water, vinegar, and an extra substance called thioquinolone that works on the morphine centers of your brain. So that when you drink, you really like it. And you're going to go after it more and more. And subsequently, they've developed a medicine called naltrexone that blocks those endorphin receptor sites from working. So if you're an alcoholic, but you take your naltrexone on a regular basis, you can drink, but you really don't care about it that much because you don't get the buzz. You don't get the good feeling. You don't get the pleasure. You don't get the reinforcement that goes with it. Another reason people drink is because of brain trauma. I mean, the single most important thing I've learned from looking at 20,000 scans is minor traumatic brain injuries change your whole life and nobody knows about it. It increases your risk in part because it decreases your judgment. It increases anxiety and depression. Those things increase your risk. Remember, we've talked about the frontal lobes as being largely inhibitory. So what that means is the frontal lobe sends signals to your emotional brain to settle down. So when you take your frontal lobes offline, your emotional brain is bouncing all around. And you're more moody, you're more obsessed, you're more anxious, you're more worried. And you bet you're going to drink more to settle it down. It decreases your ability to do things. May even decrease your IQ. Brain injuries do that. Which now you can't do the same things. You feel badly about yourself, and it's that low self-esteem that you're going to medicate. Cocaine maybe to jack it up, or maybe for you it's alcohol. So if we just look at these brains that have been injured, these brains are at increased risk for substance abuse. This is an alcoholic's brain who had open heart surgery. When he came out of open heart surgery, he got psychotic, and they called me to go see him at the hospital. And I'm reading his history. I knew his family. This guy was a mess. I mean, he was involved with domestic violence, and you know, after his open heart surgery, you know, it just takes time, and the little green men sitting on the chair next to you go away. They have other things to do, I suppose. I don't know. But when we ordered the scan, we saw this huge dent at the junction of his left frontal temporal lobe, where the red arrow is pointing to. And I went, John, do you ever have a brain injury? And he said to me, he said, Dr. Amen, he said, by golly, I did. He said, I was driving, and this is like an 80-year-old guy. He said, I was driving a milk truck in Pennsylvania. And actually, I wasn't driving. I was hanging onto the side because the driver would come up to the house, and I would just get off, deliver the milk, and get back on the truck. And so I'm up on the side, and the driver got too close to the curb, and there was a wooden pole that he ran me right into. And I was unconscious for like maybe 4 hours. And what nobody knew his whole life, I mean, he was a drunk, and he had problems, and he was aggressive, and people didn't know that maybe all of that stemmed from the driver having parietal lobe problems, direction sense problems, and he caused the head injury. See, now we're seriously into brain function, right? Right? The parietal lobes over here cause this frontal temporal lobe problem here, which then, as we'll learn when we talk about emotional trauma in a few weeks, we'll learn it fired up the children's brains and the wives' brains. And now we have a whole set of dysfunctional brains because of a car accident. So, speaking of emotional trauma, another reason people use is to settle their brains down because of emotional trauma. In one study I read, post-traumatic stress disorder occurs, PTSD, 12 to 34% of it, everybody who's in substance abuse treatment. If you don't get this connection in your patients or your clients, you're going to miss a huge part of treatment. You can't send somebody who has alcoholism and PTSD to a 12-step program only. It's not effective. Now, I'm not bad-mouthing AA at all. I think it's highly effective for many people. But you got to treat everything that's there. In women who have substance abusing problems, because you know it's less common in women, but when women have that problem, 30 to 60% of the time, they have a comorbid or co-occurring post-traumatic stress disorder. And abstinence, stopping, actually can make PTSD worse. Now, why is that? Because these substances are settling things down. Well, take away that, and the PTSD may be like this image, on fire in the brain. So people use to calm a kindled, traumatized brain. And there's a very cool treatment. There's actually a treatment study being done in Washington State. They have a drug court. They have many drug courts around the country. But there's a drug court that is doing a study on post-traumatic stress disorder and people who go to drug court. You know, drug court, if you commit an offense, but you're drinking, you know, the judge has the discretion to put you in jail or send you over to drug court, where they offer treatment options for you. How forward-thinking is that? Very cool. And for those people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, they've been doing EMDR and finding just some amazingly wonderful stories about people who drink because they've been traumatized. And if you deal with the trauma, their substance abuse is better. So, in post-traumatic stress disorder, what we see is their brain fires up. In PTSD, we see what we think of as this diamond pattern in the brain, where the top of the diamond is the anterior cingulate gyrus. The 2 points on the sides of the diamond are the basal ganglia. The bottom of the diamond is the thalamus. So when we see all of those areas hyperactive, we often think of PTSD. Plus, we see too much activity in the right lateral temporal lobe, an area we think maybe traumatic memories are stored. So we see the diamond. And with EMDR, this is a girl who was in a car accident. In fact, she got hit in the head by a frozen steak. As she got in the accident, she had groceries in the back, and a frozen steak came and whacked her on the head. And her brain just really fired up, didn't want to drive, was very anxious, not sleeping. After one session of EMDR, calmed it down. So psychotherapy is biological treatment. Okay, the real reason that we should not use drugs. I mean, they damage your brain. Hello? You know, it's sort of like, you know, it's the economy, stupid, right? It's that same thing. I mean, you know, what's the take-home message? They damage your brain. They damage you. They damage your potential. They limit your access to yourself. So, why not? Because it stalls development. And your brain is always developing. I mean, much more so when you're a child, or a teenager, or a young adult. And we saw substance abuse peaks when you're 21. It isolates you. It takes away control, right? Because it takes out your frontal lobes. The boss is gone when you're drinking. The internal supervisor you have is gone when you drink. Makes you hate yourself. I mean, we deal with drug addicts a lot. They can't stand themselves because they have no control. Keeps you from coping with your feelings, prevents you from knowing yourself. And many people think it's slow suicide. And maybe not slow, because half the people who kill themselves in the United States do it when they're drunk. Why? I mean, say you're sad. Now, many people get suicidal thoughts. In one study that they did in Seattle, 55% of the population of Seattle at some point in their life has had serious suicidal thoughts. So you get the thought, I think I'm going to kill myself. I mean, say you've had a really bad day. I think I'm going to kill myself. And then you have that other voice in your head that goes, stupid. It's a really stupid thing to do. Tomorrow will be better. But say you get the thought, I'm going to kill myself, and you drink. Now what you do is you take off your frontal lobes. Now you have no impulse control. I think I'll kill myself. Okay. A permanent solution to a temporary feeling. So one of the most fun things I've done over the last 13 years is scan people drunk. I don't know. I love doing it. I'm just so curious what it does. And this is a woman we did who had pretty severe alcohol problems. But she's like 26. I mean, she's really young. She has a brain of a 250-year-old. Right. I mean, think about the 82-year-old brain I showed you. Now, granted, that's a super healthy brain. Right? Now look at this one, and she's 26. And then look on the right. The one on the left is sober, the one on the right is drunk. I mean, it's dramatically worse. That's why people act badly when they drink, because they're taking away their brain, sort of like the brain offline. And this is a 22-year-old. I did a show with the United Paramount Network called The Truth About Drinking. And Lisa Gibbons was the host of the show, who I love for many reasons. Not just because she's beautiful, but she's smart and she cares. She has a good heart. And so when they asked me to do the show with her, I was just very excited. And my role in the show was take a 22-year-old, scan him sober, which is the brain on the left. 22, you can already see damage. His brain is prematurely aged. Looks like it's about 65 and not great for 65. And then get him drunk on national television. And we got him drunk just like how we usually got drunk. We had a highway patrol officer there, and he gave him a sobriety test, and he was legally drunk. And then we scanned him drunk, which is the one on the right. And what you see, if you look at the image on the right, in the image on the right, look at the top left scan. You see the underside of his prefrontal cortex, where there was not a hole, now there is. The judgment area of the brain. So now he has no judgment. So when you drink, things get worse. It's such a cool program. It's called The Truth About Drinking. In 1999, it won the Emmy for Best Educational Television Show. I'm very proud of that. But when you're famous, right? It's when your 10th grade daughter comes home and said, I saw you on television at school today, Dad. Because they show that program all over the world. It's very cool. Real reason not to drink? It ruins your brain. So imaging helps in many different ways. It helps you identify toxic exposure. It helps to break denial. Helps you motivate treatment. I want a better brain. And you want your clients and your patients to get that desire. How can you help them have the motivation and the desire to have the best brain that they can? Helps you identify comorbid conditions like a brain injury, or like bipolar disorder, or ADD, or anxiety disorders. You can follow the progress. How are we doing? Is your brain getting better or is it getting worse? We use scans in prevention education, as in the poster that I showed you. So if we look at cocaine and methamphetamine, usually terrible over time. But Dr. Amen, didn't you say people use that to boost it up? You bet. But over time constricts, seriously constricts blood flow to the brain and chokes off blood supply, causing what many people think are multiple tiny strokes across the surface of the brain. Well, heck, alcohol and heroin, they're suppressants. They're downers. And activity in the brain goes down. Not that helpful. And people go, but Dr. Amen, the cardiologist said I should have a couple of glasses of wine every day because it's good for my heart. Yes. A little bit of wine may in fact be good for your heart. And you may live longer. But you won't be that sharp. The research is less than daily drinking. May be helpful for both your heart and in some studies your brain. But new study from Johns Hopkins, even a little bit of drinking goes with a brain that is smaller than people who don't drink at all. I don't know. In that case, size matters. Heroin, but what else does this? Methadone! Oh my goodness! One of the most common effective treatments for heroin addicts is giving them methadone, which is another opiate. And yes, maybe they're not prostituting themselves, and maybe they're not robbing 7-Eleven anymore. But you're still keeping them cognitively impaired. That may not be the best treatment. Benzos do it. Painkillers do it. You have to be careful. And marijuana, I hate to break it to you, it's not an innocuous drug. That's why I hate California's Proposition 215, which attempted to legalize marijuana, which basically said your doctor can write you a prescription for pot for anything he wants. It's a bad drug, because as you decrease the perception that a drug is dangerous, its use goes up. Did a study in 1996 where they published in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. And the study was, we looked at people at ADD, and we looked at people who never used versus people who used a lot of pot. Now, our definition of a lot of pot was once a week for a year, which a lot of people think is not that much. But that was our definition. And what we found, people who smoke pot, overall low activity in their brain, especially in their frontal and temporal lobes. All right, I want to tell you this story. This is Joshua. Joshua came to see me in chains. Joshua was diagnosed with ADD at the age of 8. His doctor put him on Ritalin, made him worse. His doctor then put him on Dexedrine, it made him worse. Doctor then put him on Silert, and it made him worse. And then the parents took him out of treatment because the parents were tired of having their child be made worse by the doctor. And every bad thing that happens to untreated ADD kids happened to Joshua, from being in trouble in school, having trouble with the law, dropping out of school in 9th grade. And in 9th grade he started to drink. And he really liked drinking. He tried every other drug known to God and man. He didn't really care for them. He liked drinking. But the problem is that from the age of 17 to 20, he was arrested 12 times for violence. But only when he drank. And on the last occasion, now he'd been in a drug treatment program for 6 months. On the last occasion, he got drunk at a bar after he got into an obsessive, jealous argument with his girlfriend who broke up with him. Now, if you're thinking of obsessive and jealous, you should be thinking about the anterior cingulate gyrus at this point. But so, even though he's on probation, in his mind he goes, what the heck? And he gets drunk. And he gets drunk on a fifth of peach schnapps and 40 ounces of St. Ides malt liquor in about a half an hour. And then he gets into his car and drag races a friend down the highway. And they get into an accident, at which point he then gets out of the car, flags down a cab driver, leaves the scene of the accident. The cab driver drives him around San Francisco for about a half an hour, and as he starts to sober up, he thinks to himself, whoa, am I in trouble? So what the heck? He pulls a gun from his pocket, puts it to the cab driver's head, steals $25 and leaves, and turns himself in the next morning because he knew that he was in trouble. And his defense attorney, John Starr, who I love, calls me up and he said, Dr. Amen, I hear you're an expert in ADD. He said, I have a case. And he told me about the case. He said, would you help me with it? And I said, John, I'll help you with 2 conditions. He said, what's that? He said, well, the first one is you let me scan this kid, because it sounds to me like he doesn't have simple ADD. Otherwise, Ritalin or Dexedrine or Silert would have worked for him. The second condition, you have to let me get him drunk and scan him drunk. And he laughed. He said, Dr. Amen, they don't let inmates get drunk. This guy's in jail. I said, that's a condition. Figure it out. So John wrote a very nice letter to the judge, and the judge said, pretty interesting. And so they brought him to my clinic in chains, in an orange jumpsuit. He walks in, and we scan him, just the brain on the left, which some of you might recognize as the ring of fire, associated with a brain pattern that's made worse by stimulants. Often associated with bipolar disorder. When it's associated with ADD, it's not the kind of ADD that gets better with stimulants. Well, then we brought him back 2 days later. Coming in, he's in chains and shackles, his waist iron. He sits down on my couch. Now I have to tell you, I don't drink. I don't really even like drinking, but that day I'm in the liquor store. I bought the exact same brands that he had, and I got him drunk. Just like he got drunk that night of the crime. And halfway through getting him drunk, He looks at me, his eyes are starting to get a little glassy, his face is turning red, his speech is slurred. And he looks at me and he says, Dr. Amen? What, Joshua? Dr. Amen? What, Joshua? It's the worst experience of my whole life. I said, what's that? He said, my doctor is getting me drunk, and these goons, he was talking about the prison guards that were with him, these goons are watching. So we made sure we got him drunk. And then we waited an hour and a half, because from our estimate, from his last drink to the time he committed the crime was an hour and a half. And right before we scanned him, we got a blood alcohol level of 0.2. An hour and a half after his last drink, he was drunk. And then we scanned him. And you see the brain on the right. It took his brain down. Now, if you just looked at these two images, you'd go, cool. He's self-medicating. Right? He's taking down the hyperactivity, the noise, the static, the anxiety, the fear, the tension, the obsession, the jealousy in his brain. You bet. The problem is, if you look at the underside surface scans, he's wiped out his temporal lobes, especially his left temporal lobe, which is the bottom right arrow. So now he's got dark, evil, awful, violent thoughts we talk about with temporal lobe problems. And his frontal lobes went to hell. There's no function in the judgment part of his brain. I'm short of cash. I think I'll rob somebody. And he just does it, despite the fact he knew. His rational, fuller brain knew it was a bad thing to do. So he drinks as a way to medicate himself, yet he medicates himself into a brain pattern that is highly consistent with people who are violent. So what happened? I wrote a letter to the attorney. The judge and the prosecutor came to my office, and we did show and tell, because they knew this would be very powerful in court. And the prosecutor, the DA's office, wanted to put him in jail for 11 years, which is sort of reasonable. But now that they had this brain information and the whole concept of mental illness and self-medication, they came up with a plea agreement. And the plea agreement was they sent him to jail for 3 years, where he could get help. I gave him a very specific medication regimen. And when he got out at year 3, he had to see a psychiatrist every month and cooperate with the treatment for 8 years. So that makes up 11 years. 3 years in jail, 8 years probation. And if he didn't cooperate, which he has done, but if he didn't cooperate, they sent him back for the full sentence. And I think that's the perfect plea agreement. Why? Because it honors responsibility. You just can't let him go free. I mean, you know, drinking is sort of self-induced insanity, right? But yet they don't just put him away. They send him to a place where he can get help, and they give him the opportunity to get out early if he is willing to get help. It's a whole new way to think about it. Much better. Cocaine and alcohol, not very good for your brain. When you stop, your brain may get better, as in this case, but it's still not normal. It's the reason not to start. Now, I want to go through the brain systems that are also involved with abuse and consequences. So, you have to start with the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex, largest in humans and in any other animal by far. 30% of the human brain, 11% of the chimpanzee brain, 7% of your dog's brain, 3.5% of your cat's brain. I hate to break it to you, but they have no forethought. I think of my cats, there is no forethought in their behavior. Beautiful, sweet. Think of the prefrontal cortex as your supervisor. It watches you, helps you with forethought and judgment, impulse control, organization, planning, concentration, empathy, insight. Why do people act badly when they drink? Because their voice goes away. You know, that voice inside your head that says, this is okay to say it. Or, this is a stupid thing to say. Don't say it. We all get bad thoughts in our head. We all get terrible thoughts. No other living soul should ever hear from our lips. Drink. Supervisor's gone. Oh, I knew that's what he was really thinking. How do you know that? He was drunk. Life without your brain. So when there are problems in the frontal lobes, short attention span, impulse control problems, put things off, they're disorganized, they have bad judgment, lack empathy and insight. And if you kill your frontal lobes, you bet you won't have any clue that you're an alcoholic. You just won't get it. We see these drop off in ADD. We see that when we treat ADD, things get significantly better. In one of our cases, this is a guy that got arrested for running an internet pornography scam. And he basically is living his life without his frontal lobes. If you look at both images, the frontal lobes on the left image are at the bottom, and on the right image, they're up at the top, are severely abnormal. There's a study that I did with Mark Laser out of Minneapolis. He's one of the world's experts on sex addicts. And he studied 75 of them, and he used my brain system checklist. And he found there was a highly, statistically significant low activity in the prefrontal cortex, according to the checklist. There was also increased emotional activity, increased limbic activity, and increased activity in the anterior cingulate gyrus. So they got obsessed, and they had bad judgment, couldn't sort of suppress it. So it's what we would call an impulsive, compulsive disorder. Think about that a lot when you think of addictions. So think about the cingulate gyrus and the prefrontal cortex. One's low, one's high. And it's an impulsive behavior. I don't want to do it. It's not helping me. It's like a gun. Somebody's holding a gun to my head and I'm still doing it. Okay? And I can't stop. So, cingulate gyrus, brain's gear shifter. Allows you to go from thought to thought, move from idea to idea, be flexible, go with the flow, shift your attention, see options, cooperate with other people. And what we find is when it works too hard, people get stuck. They worry, they hold grudges, they may be obsessed with another person, maybe obsessed with drinking, or women, or children, or shoes. I mean, it could be whatever sort of flips off that dopamine switch in your brain. You may have compulsions, can't stop. It can be washing your hands, checking locks, picking your skin, eating, and addictions, where they lose control. And they also, it's so interesting, they tend to be oppositional and argumentative. They say no. That's why they call them dry drunks. You ever heard the term dry drunk? It's because when they stop drinking, they're still difficult. Right? In fact, people say, I liked him better when he was drunk. Because you take the hot cingulate and you settle it down so people aren't so argumentative with you. I told you the story about the truth about drinking, the video that we made. Well, one of the things that we did as part of the story is we scanned that 22-year-old's 17-year-old sister who was starting to drink. And when we scanned her brain, we knew exactly why she was drinking, because she had the ring of fire. And going down the middle, it looks like an anchor in this end, but the long arm of the anchor is the cingulate gyrus. It's just inflamed, like a flamethrower. You bet you know why she would want to drink. Basal ganglia people. You know, the basal ganglia, deep structures of the brain, integrate feeling and movement, control the body's idle, modulates anxiety, controls smooth motor movement. It's also heavily involved with something called procedural memory. It's like you learn how to shake hands with somebody, greet somebody, ride a bike, juggle when you learn how to do it. It's actually stored in your cerebellum and your basal ganglia. So when the basal ganglia are fired up, you're anxious. You tend to avoid conflict. You're socially anxious. You might predict the worst, and you might not be able to stop working or eating or whatever. When it's too low, you have ADD-like symptoms, decreased motivation. But it's when it's too high and you have social anxiety, that's when you drink to settle it down. I'm going to show you this brain. This is actually a physician who we scanned, who was using pot for about 30 years. And pot was the only thing that he was using. And we had the opportunity to scan him completely high. He showed up to our clinic for his first scan, loaded. And we didn't know it until afterwards. And what we saw, overall, he had a pretty calm brain. So if you look at the image on the left, that's on marijuana. Now look at the image on the right. This is after he stopped for a month. His brain's firing up. His wife said, off, he's much more irritable. Why? Because he's medicating his anxiety. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard wives who hate the fact that their husband's smoking pot. They buy it for them because without it, they're horrible. Now, look at the underside of his brain. It's trashed. I mean, he's got terrible overall function. Yes, he's less anxious. He's also less intelligent, less motivated. He's at high risk for dementia. Temporal lobes, we know they're involved with language and memory, mood stability, listening, reading social cues. They're also involved with rhythm and music, spiritual experience. So when there are problems in the temporal lobes, so say you've had a head injury and now you're drinking, their emotions are unstable, their memories are not good. I mean, that's where we think blackouts occur. It basically is toxic to cells on the inside of your temporal lobe. You have anxiety problems, you may get aggressive. I can't tell you. Of the 50 murderers that we have scanned, probably 45 of them did it while they were intoxicated. They have headaches, they have learning problems, and they have spiritually weird experiences. I mean, they may not be spiritual experiences that make sense to most religious people. This is Rusty. Rusty came to see us because he'd been arrested 5 times for violence, mostly when he did methamphetamine. And this is another one of those cases where he showed up loaded on a gram of methamphetamine from the night before. Now, I would never give somebody a gram of methamphetamine and say, can we look and see what that does? But if you show up that way, what the heck, you know? And so on meth is the brain on the left. It's overall terribly cold. A week later, off everything, he has a huge hot spot deep in his left temporal lobe. And we think what he was doing is he was medicating temporal lobe epilepsy with methamphetamine, which is extraordinarily dangerous. He's lucky he didn't kill anybody. And look at the outside surface of his scan, which really got him into treatment. So he went on an anti-seizure medicine to stabilize the function of his temporal lobe. What about the limbic system? In the deep limbic system, is involved, but integrates and gates sensory information, sets your emotional tone, how happy or sad you are. It's involved with bonding and connectedness, stores highly charged emotional memories. Your sense of smell, your libido is there, and when it's fired up, you're depressed, sad, moody, negative, low motivation, maybe socially isolated. You'll lose libido. People go, oh, I drink because it enhances sexuality. Not usually. Unless you have performance anxiety and you need to sort of settle it down so that you're less worried. But this is a woman who has severe postpartum depression, and you could see why she would drink. See why people with bipolar disorder use drugs? Because their brain's on fire. Works to settle it down. Now, the problem with drinking, in particular, is it kills your cerebellum. And just as a review, your cerebellum, the back bottom part of your brain, 10% of your brain's volume, but houses half the brain's neurons. Cerebellum's involved in motor control, posture, and gait. That's why when they suspect that you have been drinking and driving, they do a sobriety test, which is all about what? Motor control. You know, walk the line, touch your finger to your nose, and it's not right. But what we also know is the cerebellum is involved in executive function because it has connections with your frontal lobes. It's also involved with how quickly you can integrate new information. So when people drink, they get slow. And a lot of people don't know it's one of the major causes of dementia. Maybe the second or third most common reason why people lose their faculties with age is alcohol. So when you poison the cerebellum, people have gait and coordination problems. They have slowed thinking patterns, slowed speech, they're more impulsive, and they have poor conditioned learning, which means procedural memory is hard for them. So this is an example of one of our patients who had severe cerebellar atrophy induced by alcohol. Okay, so how do you treat these things? Well, still, one of the mainstays of treatment are 12-step programs. AA was founded in 1935. It helped to spawn a whole industry of self-help programs. The Hazelden Institute in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, helped to sort of expand it. And there are lots of support groups. It's not just AA. You can go to NA, and CA, and OA, and SA. There are inpatient programs, there are outpatient programs, and we've come to realize that it's critical to understand dual diagnosis and self-medication. I was the director of the dual diagnosis unit at a psychiatric hospital in Fairfield when I first started doing imaging. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with imaging, because it helped me figure out better people who had issues with addictions. So, many of these 12-step programs have a spiritual connection. For some people who are atheists, it can be a little problematic for them. And so there are things like SMART and rational recovery that don't include that. Now, clearly the support helps, sponsors help. It's getting you connected, and working the 12 steps help, which if you haven't read the big book in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's worth reading because many of the steps are very helpful. And the first one is where you admit that you're powerless. It's basically saying this thing's got me and I have to give it up. Give it over because I can't fix this on my own. There's this sort of spiritual principle there somewhere, isn't it? You know, there are ways to quit all at once. Some people quit gradually. I mean, if you've been drinking a fifth a day and you just stop, you may go into delirium tremens or DTs. You have a 10% risk of dying. So we have medicines that can help you come down slowly. I recently did that with a patient, and he stopped drinking, and to avoid getting sick and throwing up his guts, we put him on Depakote, anticonvulsant, to settle him down, put him on Ativan, anti-anxiety medicine, to settle them down, gave them B vitamins because people who drink or use drugs are often nutritionally very deficient. And, did that for a few days, and then we started tapering off. So, 7 or 8 days, he was off and not sick. I like antabuse. You might know what antabuse is. It makes people sick. So if you're drinking, we'll give you antabuse. You have to take antabuse every day. It's your commitment to sobriety. And what antabuse does is usually has no side effects. But if you drink and have antabuse in your system, it makes you sick as a dog. Your blood pressure goes up. You get these pounding, throbbing headaches. You throw up your gut. Your stomach feels awful. You're sick. And so it's behavior modification treatment, if you will. And I've used it a lot and find it very successful, especially in the early stages of recovery. It's my commitment every day not to drink. Now, there is some problems with it because any alcohol that you get, alcohol in the deodorant that you use can make you sick. Alcohol in the mouthwash you use can make you sick. If you're at a restaurant and they cook with alcohol, it can make you sick. So you have to do a lot of education, and you give people this little card, I'm taking antabuse. If I have a reaction, this is what you should do about it. We talked about earlier naltrexone. Naltrexone blocks endorphin receptors, so you don't get high when you drink, so you don't really care that much. It's not as much fun when you drink. Another thing that's critical is you have to get rid of the triggers, which means you have to change your friends. If you're drinking, and that's what this guy did, we got him sober, and then he went to a Super Bowl party with his friends were drinking, and he drank because the triggers were overwhelming for him. So the triggers can be many things, from the shape of a bottle, to an environment, to somebody smoking, to whatever it might be. Staying sober, you have to treat underlying brain problems. Your diet matters. There are many programs that help people get rid of sugar, and they find they can increase sobriety. Supplements, amino acids seem to be helpful. Exercise, time to heal, new learning, like reading Men's Health, since I write a column every month in Men's Health. It's obviously a good way to do it. All of these things are part of recovery. It's critical to get the family involved because families just get trashed in the process. So recommend Al-Anon to teach them how to deal with a family member, somebody they love, how to deal with it. And it's important to let children know what their risks are and to understand the whole psychodynamics behind children of alcoholics. I did my research on grandchildren of alcoholics because my wife had grown up in a severely abusive alcoholic home. And I wondered what the matter with her was when we got married. It's like, why are you mad all the time? And why are you sad? And, and she'd seen lots of people. And I went to the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. That's where I did my alcohol and drug training as a psychiatrist. And I sat in a lecture on adult children of alcoholics. I never even heard the term. And I went, describe my wife. And I went home, I said, you're an adult child of an alcoholic. I have to tell you, it's terrible being married to a shrink. I mean, it's just not that good. Because I always have labels for things. And she looked at me and she said, my dad's not an alcoholic. At which point, my jaw just like dropped open. Hello? Because, I'd been hearing the stories. We'd been married a couple of years at that point, how he'd come home drunk, 8 times out of 10, how he'd beat his wife, scare the kids, definition of an alcoholic. If you drink and it gets you into trouble, and you do it again, you're an alcoholic. It's like, what do you mean he's not an alcoholic? The denial in these families is so high. And, she finally sort of got it, and they had support group meetings, ACA meetings, or ACOA meetings, adult children of alcoholics. And the central issues is they don't trust, and they don't talk, and they don't feel. And Sometimes there are many different roles they'll play in the family, from being super responsible to, you know, being the scapegoat of it. But it's a fascinating, very important sort of set of psychological conditions to understand. So how do you prevent it? Prevention's more important than anything. It's education and proper modeling, and you supervise kids. Kids who are at risk, you need to know where they're at, who they're with, and what they're doing. Prevent advertising to children or teens or near children or teens. You have to teach brain science and brain love early and often. So I'm thinking of coming out with a line of brain jewelry. What do you think about that? So it was Valentine's Day, and for my sweetheart I went into Tiffany's, and I'm looking for a brain, because I don't love her with my heart. My heart's a muscle. I'm looking for, and they didn't have a brain. I'm like offended here. And people think I'm really strange, and the woman at Tiffany's probably still talking about me in the back room. It's like, you know, good, this doctor wants a brain jewelry. He's really messed up. But yeah, we need to teach brain love. Okay, so ultimately it comes down to this. Which brain do you want? So the question is, what reaction that makes you tolerant? Well, tolerance happens, you know, as you drink more and you like the feeling, you start chasing the feeling. It takes more and more to get the same response, because your neurons sort of get used to this higher level of whatever pleasure substance that's being produced by the substance that you're abusing. And it can be with food, it can be with alcohol, it can be with cocaine, it can be with methamphetamine, it can be with whatever. If that substance doesn't give you a buzz, there's no payoff for it. And if there's no payoff, why would you spend money on it, spend time? Why would you do something illegal if there's no payoff? The question is about the Seattle statistic, where 55% of the general population has at some point in their life seriously considered suicide. I think there are a number of reasons. You know, I think the incidence of depression in the U.S. or in the world in general is pretty high. And so if you're depressed or you feel anxious, you think about checking out. Now, if we go to Seattle, what we see is the sun is not out enough in Seattle. And so there's a dramatically higher incidence of seasonal affective disorder, and that goes with a higher incidence of depression and suicidal ideation, you bet. So the question is, in your sex addiction lecture, the teacher said that there are some people who will have sex with members of their same sex, so guys with guys and girls with girls, and they will not be considered homosexual. Well, homosexual will only be if they exclusively sort of want another guy. And she said that they weren't bisexual. And I think probably, you know, I don't know because I can't read minds, but what she was thinking is they really weren't interested in both sexes. What they were was driven. So that when they're healthy, they're really interested in a partner of the opposite sex, but they had a compulsion or an addiction to go after somebody of the same sex. So that's probably what she meant, is that they didn't prefer, I like going both ways. And often in an addiction, one, you know you don't want to, and you can't stop. The question is, how much is okay? And I think what many scientists would say is that the current research suggests that less than daily drinking, so maybe 2 or 3 times a week, In my new book, Preventing Alzheimer's, that's what we talk about. It's probably okay. Daily drinking increases your risk for brain trouble. And so, if you like a glass of wine with dinner, don't do it every day. Think of it as 2 or 3 times a week. The new study from Johns Hopkins, really sort of suggested that any drinking, you ended up with a smaller brain.